The lawyer cleared his throat and looked directly at my golden brother. The estate goes entirely to Marcus, with the exception of the vintage car collection, which goes to Alex. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I just smiled the same way I'd been smiling for 3 months, ever since I'd discovered what my parents were planning. My name is Alex Porter, and I just watched my family hand my brother everything they owned while giving me wheels that wouldn't start. What they didn't know was that I'd already beaten them to the finish line. Around the conference table, my relatives shifted uncomfortably. Marcus grinned like he'd won the lottery. My parents avoided my eyes. The lawyer continued reading, but I stopped listening after the car collection part. Those rusted classics in the garage were about to become the biggest surprise of my brother's life. Growing up, Marcus was the star. Quarterback in high school, business degree, married his college sweetheart. I was the quiet one who fixed computers and read too many books. Mom always said Marcus would run the family hardware business someday. Dad nodded along, never mentioning that I was the one who'd been balancing their books for 5 years. When Marcus moved back home after his divorce, they welcomed him like a returning hero. When I graduated with my computer science degree, they asked if I'd finally get a real job. The difference in treatment was so normal, I stopped noticing it. Marcus got the upstairs bedroom with the view. I got the basement. He got praised for helping with inventory on weekends. I got taken for granted for handling all their digital systems during the week. 3 months before Dad's heart attack, I was updating their computer system when I found the draft will. It was sitting in a folder marked legal documents that I was supposed to back up. My hands froze over the keyboard as I read my name next to vintage car collection. Everything else went to Marcus. The house, the business, the savings, even Mom's jewelry. I printed a copy and sat staring at it for an hour. They divided their life's work between their sons, and I'd gotten the cars that hadn't run since 2015. That night at dinner, they asked about my day like nothing had changed. Marcus talked about expanding the business. They hung on every word. I mentioned fixing their inventory software, and Dad grunted thanks without looking up from his phone. The smart thing would have been to confront them. Instead, I did something else. I drove to the garage and really looked at those cars for the first time. Dad's 1967 Mustang, rusted and forgotten. His 1970 Camaro with the flat tires. The 1969 Dodge Charger that leaked oil onto cardboard. Junk, just like I'd always thought. But then I noticed something. Under years of dust and neglect, these weren't ordinary muscle cars. The Mustang was a Shelby GT500. The Camaro was an SS with the original engine. The Charger was an RT with numbers matching. I pulled out my phone and started researching. What I found made my heart pound. These weren't worthless classics. They were gold mines that my parents had completely forgotten about. I spent the next week learning everything about vintage cars. The Shelby alone was worth more than most people made in 2 years, even in its current condition. Restored, it could buy a house. The other two weren't far behind. My parents had bought them cheap in the 1980s, planning to fix them up someday. Someday never came, and they'd forgotten what they actually owned. I found the original purchase documents in Dad's filing cabinet. He'd paid $3,000 for the Shelby in 1987. Today it was worth $200,000 as it sat. Restored, maybe double that. I made copies of everything and started making quiet phone calls to restoration experts. My inheritance was about to become very interesting, but I needed to be careful about timing. Dad's heart attack came on a Tuesday. I was at work when Marcus called, his voice shaking. "Dad's in the hospital. It's bad." I drove straight there, finding my family in the waiting room. Mom looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Marcus paced like a caged animal. For 3 days, we took turns sitting by Dad's bed while machines beeped around him. He pulled through, but barely. The doctor said his heart was damaged. No more lifting, no more stress, retirement was mandatory. That evening, Mom pulled Marcus aside. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Marcus nodding seriously. They were already planning the business transition. I pretended not to notice when they stepped outside to call their lawyer. The will was about to become official. While Dad recovered, I took over more responsibilities at the store. Marcus was good with customers but terrible with numbers. I handled ordering, payroll, and taxes, while he charmed everyone who walked through the door. Our parents saw his public face and my quiet work, but only valued what they could see. One afternoon, I overheard Mom telling a customer how proud she was that Marcus would inherit the business. "Alex is good with computers," she added, "but Marcus has the people skills." The customer nodded politely. I kept counting inventory and said nothing. That night, I called 3 different car restoration shops. The estimates I got made me smile. My worthless inheritance was looking better every day. The lawyer's appointment was scheduled for the following Friday. Mom mentioned it casually over breakfast, like they were discussing the weather. "We're updating some paperwork," she told me. "Just boring legal stuff." Marcus winked at me behind her back, thinking he was keeping their secret. I nodded and asked if they needed me to drive them. They said Marcus would handle it. Of course he would. That afternoon, I visited the garage again. I'd been quietly cleaning the cars, removing decades of dust and debris. Under the grime, original paint showed through on all 3. Chrome bumpers gleamed after polishing. These machines wanted to be beautiful again. I took detailed photos of serial numbers, engine codes, and trim options. My research was almost complete. Friday came, and they left for the lawyer's office without mentioning it again. I stayed home, supposedly working on their website. Instead, I called automotive appraisers. The first one laughed when I described the cars over the phone. "Kid, if those numbers are real, you're sitting on a fortune." He agreed to come look the next week. I scheduled 2 more appraisers for different days. I wanted multiple opinions before making any moves. When my parents returned, they seemed relieved. Marcus looked smug. Dad patted my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, son. We'll always take care of you." I thanked him and went back to my computer. Taking care of me was exactly what they'd just done, though not how they'd planned. The appraisers came separately, each more excited than the last. The first one spent 2 hours measuring, photographing, and cross-referencing numbers. "These are the real deal," he said, shaking his head. "Your parents have no idea what they own." The second appraiser was even more enthusiastic. "The Shelby alone is worth $180,000 to $220,000, depending on restoration quality. Together, you're looking at over $500,000. I asked him to put everything in writing. He handed me an official appraisal document that made my hands shake. The third appraiser confirmed what the others had said. My worthless inheritance was worth more than everything else my parents owned combined. I kept the appraisals locked in my desk and continued life as normal. Marcus talked more about his plans for the business. Mom fretted about Dad's health. Dad pretended retirement wasn't killing him slowly. Nobody mentioned the will, but the secret hung in the air like smoke. I helped customers, fixed their computers, and listened to my family discuss futures that didn't include me. One evening, Marcus cornered me in the kitchen. "You know I'll always look out for you, right?" he said. "When I take over, you'll always have a job here." I thanked him and meant it. He wasn't cruel, just clueless like our parents. None of them understood what they'd actually given me. 2 months passed quietly. Dad grew stronger, Mom worried less, and Marcus started making small changes to the store. I documented everything, keeping careful records of inventory, sales, and expenses. If they were going to push me out slowly, I wanted proof of my contributions. But mostly I researched cars. I learned about restoration costs, market trends, and collector demands. I contacted specialty dealers and auction houses. My 3 rusty projects had become my secret obsession. One evening, I found Dad in the garage staring at the Mustang. "I always meant to fix these up," he said sadly. "Ran out of time." I put my hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's not too late," I said. He smiled, not knowing how right I was. The call came on a Wednesday. Dad had another heart attack at the store, massive this time. Marcus found him collapsed behind the counter. By the time I reached the hospital, it was over. Dad was gone at 58, taking all his plans and secrets with him. The funeral was a blur of flowers and sympathy. Relatives flew in from across the country. Everyone had stories about Dad's kindness, his work ethic, his love for his family. Marcus gave a speech about carrying on Dad's legacy. I sat in the front row and said nothing. The lawyer approached Mom after the service. "We should meet soon," he said quietly. There are things to discuss. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Mom spent the week in a daze, overwhelmed by insurance forms and bank statements. Marcus handled the funeral arrangements and tried to keep the store running. I took care of the house and made sure bills got paid. We moved around each other carefully, grief making everything fragile. Nobody talked about the will directly, but I caught Marcus and Mom whispering in corners. They thought they were protecting me from financial stress. Really, they were protecting me from their guilt about cutting me out. I let them whisper and continued my research. Death had accelerated my timeline, but not changed my plans. If anything, Dad's passing made me more determined to honor what he'd unknowingly given me. The lawyer's office was downtown, all dark wood and law books. Mom wore her funeral dress again. Marcus had bought a new suit. I wore jeans and the polo shirt I'd worn to work that morning. We sat around a polished conference table while Mr. Thompson shuffled papers. "This is straightforward," he said. "Your father's wishes were very clear." He started with small items. Dad's tools to Marcus, Mom's jewelry staying with her, family photos to be shared. Then came the big announcement. The house, the business, and all savings accounts went to Marcus. I got the vintage car collection, period. The room fell silent. Marcus looked guilty but relieved. Mom dabbed her eyes. Mr. Thompson waited for questions. "I'm sorry, Alex," Mom whispered. "We thought the cars meant something to you." I smiled and squeezed her hand. "They do," I said honestly. "Dad always talked about fixing them up, together." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "You know I'll split everything fairly," he said. "This is just legal paperwork." I shook my head. Dad made his choice, I respect it. Mr. Thompson looked surprised by my calm reaction. Most people would have been screaming about unfairness. Instead, I signed the transfer documents without complaint. Marcus inherited a successful business with steady profits. I inherited 3 broken cars that hadn't run in years. On paper, it looked like the worst deal in family history. In reality, I'd just won the lottery. We drove home in separate cars, each lost in our own thoughts. At the house, Marcus immediately started talking about keeping me involved in the business. Mom worried about my future. Both of them felt guilty about the will, but not guilty enough to change it. I made coffee and listened to their plans for my life. Part-time work at the store, help with computers, staying in the basement bedroom. They meant well, but they were planning to keep me as their charity case forever. I nodded along and made appropriate sounds while calculating restoration costs in my head. The Shelby alone would need $80,000 to reach show quality. But a $200,000 return on that investment seemed worthwhile. That night, I sat in the garage with my inheritance. 3 forgotten classics that Dad had planned to restore someday. In the dim light, I could see their potential. Clean lines under the rust, powerful engines under the dust. These weren't just cars, they were time machines waiting to return to their glory days. I ran my hands over the Shelby's hood and made a decision. Tomorrow, I would start making calls. Not to restoration shops, but to collectors and auction houses. I had 3 choices: restore them myself, hire professionals, or sell them as they were. Each option had different risks and rewards. But all 3 options made me wealthier than my brother would ever imagine. The next morning, I called Hartley Auctions, the most prestigious classic car auction house in the state. "I have 3 barn finds," I told them. 1967 Shelby GT 500, 1970 Camaro SS, 1969 Charger RT. All numbers matching. The silence on the phone lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Are you serious?" the agent finally asked. I sent him the photos and documentation. He called back within an hour. "We need to see these immediately. If they're authentic, you're looking at significant money." We scheduled an appointment for Friday. I told my family I was job hunting. Technically, that was true. My new job was about to be managing a small fortune. The auction house expert arrived with a trailer and a team. Mom and Marcus watched from the house windows as strangers swarmed our garage. "What's all this?" Marcus asked, joking. "Probably just someone interested in the scrap metal." I smiled and said nothing. The expert spent 3 hours examining every detail. Serial numbers, engine codes, body panels, interior pieces. His excitement was barely contained professional calm. "These are absolutely authentic," he told me privately. The Shelby is unrestored survivor quality, the Camaro and Charger are solid restoration candidates. We're talking serious collector money. He handed me a preliminary estimate that made my knees weak. My worthless inheritance was worth $650,000 minimum. I kept the estimate folded in my wallet and continued acting normal. Marcus worried about my future while sitting on a business worth maybe $200,000 on a good day. Mom fretted about my lack of steady income while I carried documentation of assets worth more than our house. The irony was delicious, but I wasn't ready to reveal it yet. First, I needed to understand my options completely. Selling at auction would bring top dollar but cost 10% in fees. Selling privately would save fees but take longer. Restoring first would maximize value but require significant upfront investment. I had decisions to make, but all roads led to financial independence. My parents had accidentally given me the keys to a kingdom they didn't know existed. 2 weeks later, Marcus made his first major business decision. He hired his friend Kevin to help with sales, essentially replacing me without firing me. "You're too valuable with computers to waste on customers," he explained. Really, he was creating distance between me and the family business. Kevin would get salary and commission. I would get part-time computer work. Mom nodded along, thinking they were being kind. I smiled and agreed to the arrangement. Why fight over a small business when I was sitting on enough money to start 10 businesses? That afternoon, I called the auction house and scheduled my consignment. The spring collector car auction was 3 months away. Perfect timing to start my new life. I spent those 3 months quietly preparing. Professional photos of all 3 cars, complete documentation packages, insurance appraisals for auction house requirements. I told my family I was freelancing computer work, which explained my frequent absences and secretive phone calls. Marcus grew more confident running the store. Mom started talking about selling the house and moving somewhere smaller. Both of them worried about my future, never suspecting I was planning theirs. The auction catalog arrived 6 weeks before the sale. There were my cars on glossy pages, described in loving detail. Rare barn finds from longtime ownership, the descriptions read. The estimated values made me giddy. The auction was held at the state fairgrounds on a sunny Saturday in May. Marcus and Mom had driven to visit relatives, giving me perfect cover. I wore my best clothes and tried to look casual while my future was decided by collectors with deep pockets. The Charger went first, selling for $85,000 to a man in a cowboy hat. The Camaro brought $95,000 from a dealer planning full restoration. Then came the Shelby. Bidding started at $100,000 and climbed steadily. $155,000. $200,000. When the hammer fell at $235,000, I couldn't breathe. In 3 hours, my worthless inheritance had become $415,000. After fees and taxes, I was looking at enough money to disappear forever. I drove home with a cashier's check in my jacket pocket and a new understanding of karma. My parents had tried to push me aside, giving my brother everything while leaving me with junk. Instead, they'd accidentally handed me more money than the rest of the inheritance combined. That evening, Marcus called excitedly about a big sale he'd made. Mom worried about my job prospects. I listened and made supportive sounds while planning my exit strategy. Tomorrow, I would buy a house with cash. Next week, I would start the computer consulting business I'd always wanted. Next month, I would tell my family about the auction. By then, I'd be financially independent and emotionally ready for their shock. My parents had cut me out of their will, but they'd given me something better. The chance to build my own legacy from the ground up.